Her hands are bare for one more moment, resting palm up on a cushion of crimson velvet, while a gentlewoman kneels before her, working a pair of gloves, dewskin so fine it has been scented with orris root and ambergris until the leather itself seems to breathe. It is April of 1520, and Katherine of Aragon, Queen of England, is being dressed for a formal reception in her privy chamber at Greenwich, the low morning light coming gold and slanted through leaded glass onto a room hung floor to ceiling in woven wall hangings. The badge she brought with her from Spain 19 years earlier, and has never once let go of. Her gown is a deep, tawny damask, the bodice stiff with pearls sewn in a lattice across the front, and her hood, the old-fashioned English gable style. She still favors, though the younger women at court have begun drifting toward looser French styles, frames a face that has learned through 19 years of English winters and English politics to hold itself in careful, composed stillness, regardless of what is actually happening underneath it. Behind her, another woman works a comb through the last uncovered inch of hair before the hood closes over it, and a third stands ready with a small enameled box of rose water, a fourth near the door with the Queen's prayer book, because a queen does not simply walk from one room to another in this palace. She proceeds, and a proceeding requires attendants stationed at every stage of it, each with a single task, each rehearsed in it until the whole sequence looks less like being dressed and more like a kind of quiet, practiced liturgy. Incense drifts faintly from a censer set near the oratory in the corner of the room, sweetening air that would otherwise carry other things entirely. And by the time the gloves are drawn fully up over her wrists and the last pearl pin set into her hood, Katherine of Aragon looks precisely like what 19 years of careful construction have built her to look like. The daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs of Spain. A woman entirely composed, entirely still, entirely correct, every visible particular. It is a beautiful scene if you do not know what stands just behind it, damask and pearls and the low gleam of morning light on worked gold thread. A queen's hands, gloved and folded, ready to receive whoever waits beyond that door. Paint it, and it looks exactly like every surviving portrait of Katherine of Aragon that still hangs in English galleries. A woman built entirely of dignity, without a single visible crack anywhere in the surface. Beneath all of that damask, the pearls, the incense, and the carefully rehearsed stillness, the actual room this scene is taking place, inside, smells of something considerably less composed. It smells of rushes that have not been changed since before Lent, trodden soft and dark by hundreds of feet a day, of wool worn for months without ever meeting water, of tallow and stale ale, and the particular closeness of too many bodies kept too long inside stone walls. The gentlewoman kneeling before the Queen with those scented gloves has not fully bathed since the autumn. Underneath the Queen's own tawny damask, against her own bare skin, sits a garment of coarse horsehair that no portrait, no ambassador's dispatch meant for public reading, and no polished account of her reign will ever mention, because almost nobody beyond this room was ever meant to know it was there at all. The story of what actually filled Katherine of Aragon's household in the year 1520 is far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more human than any painting of this queen, gloved and composed, and glowing faintly gold in the morning light, will ever let you see. Since 1520, 11 years into Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII, and 30 years before anyone in England will have a word for what actually causes disease to spread from one body to the next. The court she presides over runs on a medical understanding inherited from Galen and refined across more than 1,000 years of scholarship. The conviction that the body is governed by 4 humours, blood and phlegm and the 2 biles, and that health depends on keeping them in careful balance through diet, bloodletting, and constant vigilance against corrupted air. It runs too on a religious devotion so total that a queen who could command any comfort available in Europe chooses, several nights a week, to kneel on bare stone until her knees bleed, and tells almost nobody. And it runs, every single day, on the labor of somewhere close to 200 people crowded into stone quarters that were never designed to hold them, women and men who carry water and firewood and chamber vessels, up narrow back stairs from before dawn until well after dark, who sleep on straw a few feet from where they worked all day, and who understand, every one of them, that a single misstep in front of the wrong person can end a career and a reputation in the space of an afternoon. This is a video about what that household actually felt like, smelled like, and demanded of the people living inside it. Not the version smoothed for ambassadors' letters home. Not the version that survives in a handful of formal Spanish and Venetian dispatches praising the Queen's piety and her household's good order. A closer, more honest version, built from the household accounts, the physician's manuals, and the later testimony of the women who served closest to her, women whose recollections would eventually reach the ears of Catherine's fiercest defender at the English court, a Savoyard lawyer. Though he himself would not set foot in England until 1529, 9 years after the year this hour is centered on. What Chapuis heard from Catherine's oldest attendants during the long, dangerous years of her divorce, women who had served her since the early 1522 and had nowhere left to be discreet for, forms one thread of what survives about this household at all, layered here against the contemporary Spanish and Venetian accounts, the royal household ordinances, and the physical evidence of the palaces themselves. It means walking through a household where the Queen's own gentlewomen slept on the floor of her outer chamber a few feet from where she prayed, where chamber pots sat under velvet skirts until they could be carried down and emptied twice a day into open courtyards, and where a queen renowned across Europe for her serene public dignity spent a portion of nearly every private hour she had in quiet, deliberate physical suffering that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with a faith she had carried with her since Spain. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history you find worth your time, the real version instead of the polished one, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this kind of careful, sourced history keep getting made. And if there is a court or a household from this period you would like to see examined this closely, leave it in the comments. I read every one of them. Let us begin then, not with the Queen in her gloves and pearls, but with the woman kneeling in front of her, fastening them, because her hands, chapped from cold water and years of careful, unglamorous work, tell you considerably more about what 1520 actually asked of a body than the Queen's folded gloved ones ever will. Her name, in the records that survive her, would eventually be written simply as Mistress Hall, though for the first decade of her life in England she answered to Beatriz Fernandez, and in the spring of 1520, a gentlewoman of Queen Catherine's privy chamber and one of the last of the original Spanish household, still standing in it. She came to England as a girl of 10 in the autumn of 1501, part of the retinue that crossed the Bay of Biscay with the young Catalina, Infanta of Spain, on her way to marry Prince Arthur, and she has watched, in the 19 years since, nearly every other Spanish face from that crossing either return home, marry into obscurity, or die. Only a handful remained close to the Queen at all by 1520. Maria de Salinas, now Lady Willoughby, by marriage to one of the wealthiest men in Lincolnshire, remains the closest of them, a woman of real rank now, trusted with the actual running of the Queen's household and its increasingly strained finances. Beatriz occupies a lower rung, a working gentlewoman rather than a peer's wife, but she has held her place at the Queen's side through every reversal of the last 2 decades, precisely because she has made herself, through 19 years of quiet competence. She is a small woman, not much over 5 feet, with the kind of build that comes from decades of physical service rather than leisure. Strong through the forearms from years of lacing bodices and lifting linen chests, her knuckles swollen slightly at the joints in a way she has started this past winter to notice on cold mornings, before anyone else is awake, to see her flex the stiffness out of them. Her hair, when it is not entirely hidden under a hood, is dark and still thick, though she has found 3 grey strands at her temple in the last year that she has not mentioned to anyone. Her hands, chapped and reddened from the cold water she washes her face and throat with each morning, are considerably rougher than the Queen's own, and she keeps them tucked into her sleeves whenever she is not actively working, a small private habit of vanity she would deny having if anyone asked her about it. What is expected of Beatrice, every day of her life, at this court, is a level of physical labor that the word attendant does very little to describe. She rises before 4 most mornings to help prepare the Queen's chamber before Catherine herself wakes for early mass. She assists through the hour and more of dressing that this hour has already walked through once. She sits near the Queen through long stretches of the day, reading aloud or working alongside her at needlework, and when night finally comes, she is one of 2 or 3 gentlewomen who do not go to any private lodging of their own at all. She sleeps on a straw pallet laid across the floor of the Queen's outer chamber, a few feet from the door of the room where Catherine herself sleeps, because a Queen of England is never at any hour left without someone close enough to reach her within seconds. Beatrice has slept this way, on and off, for the better part of 2 decades. Her back has paid for it in a low, familiar ache that she has simply stopped mentioning to the household's physician, because mentioning it has never once changed anything about her duties. There is one detail about Beatrice that no household account, no dispatch, no formal record will ever preserve, because nobody with the authority to write anything down was ever in the room to notice it. Some nights, lying on that pallet in the dark, she still counts in Spanish rather than English before she lets herself fall asleep, a habit left over from a childhood she can barely remember clearly anymore, in a country she has not seen in 19 years, and almost certainly never will again. She has never told the Queen this. She suspects, without ever having asked, that Catherine does something very similar herself. On the nights, sleep does not come easily. Let us follow Beatrice through an ordinary week of this spring. Then, because her body, worked and aching, and quietly homesick in a country she has spent her entire adult life serving, is about to show us exactly what this household actually demanded of everyone living inside its walls. If you picture a Queen's household in 1520, you probably picture space. Long galleries, high ceilings, room enough for a Queen and her attendants to move through the day without ever feeling crowded. The sort of grandeur the word palace still implies to a modern ear. Greenwich itself, seen from the river, gives exactly that impression. A long red brick frontage with turrets and glazed windows catching the light, built by Catherine's own father-in-law 2 decades earlier to announce to anyone arriving by water that the Tudor dynasty had money and meant to be taken seriously. It is a reasonable assumption. It is also almost entirely wrong for the people actually living inside that frontage, because grandeur at this court was a quality reserved for the rooms a visitor was permitted to see. The actual reality is considerably more cramped. Catherine's own household by 1520 runs to something close to 160 people in ordinary daily attendance, a figure the historian Neville Williams has traced through the surviving accounts. And that number does not include the additional cooks, grooms, and casual laborers drawn in. The 33 wives of English noblemen, who had by this point been added to her original Spanish retinue as ladies-in-waiting, supplementing rather than replacing the handful of Spanish women, like Beatrice, who remained. On an ordinary week, that figure alone strains the private apartments allotted to a queen's establishment. In the spring of 1520, with the court in the middle of preparing for what will become, that June, the single most lavish diplomatic spectacle either England or France has ever staged, the meeting near Calais, that history will eventually nickname the Field of Cloth of Gold. The number swells considerably further. Extra tailors, extra kitchen staff, brought in to manage a household, about to travel and entertain on a scale nobody currently serving it has ever attempted before. All of them need somewhere to sleep. Very few of them get anywhere resembling privacy to do it in. The rooms themselves tell the real story better than any household role. A queen's outer chamber, the room just beyond her own private bedchamber, functioned as a combination of reception room, workspace, dormitory, and at night, straw pallets like the one Beatrice sleeps on were laid out across whatever floor space the day's furniture left uncovered. Gentlewomen and chamberers packed close enough that a person turning over in her sleep might well nudge the woman beside her awake. Further down the household hierarchy, in the shared lodgings given over to lower servants, the crowding grew worse rather than better. Several people to a room not much larger than a modern closet, in a wing of the palace that saw considerably less of the fresh rush replacement. Windows in these lodgings were often small, deliberately so, since large expanses of glass were both expensive, and in the era's own medical thinking, a liability, letting in precisely the sort of night air that physicians warned carried disease. The result, across nearly every part of the household beyond the Queen's own most immediate rooms, was air that simply did not move, trapped by low ceilings, small windows, and the sheer density of bodies breathing inside a space built long before anyone thought seriously about ventilation as a health concern in its own right. Then there were the rushes. Nearly every floor in the palace not covered in stone flag or the increasingly fashionable Spanish and Flemish tile that Catherine herself had helped popularize was strewn with rushes, cut reeds, and grasses laid down as both insulation and a kind of primitive carpet, meant to be lifted and replaced regularly as the top layer grew soiled. In practice, in a household running at this pace, that replacement happened considerably less often than the theory demanded. The scholar Desiderius Erasmus, writing to a physician in Cardinal Wolsey's own household the following year, in September of 1521, left behind one of the most quoted descriptions of English domestic flooring to survive from this exact period. Observing that English floors were commonly laid with clay and strewn with rushes, so imperfectly renewed that the layer underneath sometimes went 20 years undisturbed, harboring, in his own words, spittle and vomit, and the leakage of dogs and men, spilled ale, scraps of fish. Erasmus was writing about English households in general, rather than the Queen's own chambers specifically, and a royal household did maintain considerably stricter standards than an ordinary merchant's home. But the underlying mechanism he described, rushes trapping whatever fell on them rather than releasing it, operated in every rush-strewn room in England, royal or otherwise, and a household serving close to 200 people, with dogs moving freely through many of its public rooms, generated exactly the kind of accumulation Erasmus was describing faster than any single household could realistically keep pace with. For Beatrice, the crowding was not an abstraction to be read about in a scholar's letter. It was the specific physical fact of her nights. A straw pallet lay close enough to two other sleeping women that she had long since learned to fall asleep despite another person's breathing, a few feet from her own face, and it was the low, constant awareness present in every room she moved through during the day. Of exactly how many other bodies occupied the same close air she was breathing. She had grown so accustomed to the particular smell of the outer chamber by evening, rushes and tallow smoke and the day's accumulated warmth of 40 or 50 people moving through a single suite of rooms, that she rarely noticed it consciously anymore. The way a person stops hearing a mill wheel they have lived beside for years. It was only on the rare occasions she stepped outside to the palace gardens, into air that moved and thinned and carried the smell of the river instead, that the contrast registered at all, and even then, only for a moment before the next task pulled her attention back indoors. The broader context here matters because it corrects a natural, comfortable assumption about wealth and space that this era simply does not support. A queen's household was crowded, not because nobody had thought to build it larger, but because a large retinue was itself a form of prestige. Visible proof of a household's importance, measured in the sheer number of people it could support and command. The historian Alison Weir, writing about the structure of Tudor royal households more broadly, has described the same logic running through every great establishment of the period. A household size functioning as a kind of walking advertisement for its head's rank and wealth. Which meant that the crowding this hour has just described was not a failure of planning so much as the direct and avoidable cost of exactly the grandeur a queen's household was built to project in the first place. The living historian Ruth Goodman, who has spent considerable time reconstructing the physical realities of exactly this kind of Tudor domestic space, has observed that modern visitors touring the surviving Tudor palaces today, their rooms now emptied of furniture and stripped of the woven hangings that once absorbed both sound and smell, consistently underestimate just how full and how close these spaces actually felt when properly inhabited, since an empty museum room and a room holding 40 sleeping bodies, 3 dogs, and the accumulated warmth of a full day's activity are in every meaningful sense 2 entirely different buildings. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour moves any further into the household's daily rhythms. The crowding Beatrice lived inside every night of her adult life was not a sign of neglect, hers or anyone else's. It was simply the ordinary, unremarkable cost of belonging to one of the most important households in England, a cost measured in shared air, borrowed privacy, and rushes that never quite managed to stay as clean as the room above them looked. And critically, every single person sleeping in that outer chamber understood the arrangement in exactly the same terms Beatrice did, which meant that nobody around her ever had reason to name the crowding as a hardship worth complaining about. It was simply what a household this size, in a building this old, on rooms this treasured for their grandeur rather than their comfort, had always been. Now the clothing, because the clothing was where the crowding this hour has already described, met an even more stubborn problem, one that no amount of careful housekeeping could fully solve. If you picture what a Tudor gentlewoman, or a queen herself, actually wore against her own skin day after day, you probably picture something regularly washed, laundered, the way any modern garment worn close to the body gets laundered, simply as a matter of basic hygiene nobody would think twice about. The truth of Tudor court dress runs almost entirely in the opposite direction, and understanding why requires setting aside a modern assumption that would have struck nearly everyone at Catherine's court as faintly reckless. The actual reality is that wool, silk, velvet, and damask, the fabrics that made up the outer layers of every gown at this court, from a chamberer's plain kirtle to the Queen's own pearled bodice, were never washed with water at all. Water damaged these fabrics badly, shrinking wool, warping the careful drape of a cut velvet, and running the dyes that had often cost more than the labor of making the garment in the first place. Instead, outer garments were maintained through brushing, a servant working a stiff bristle brush across the fabric to lift dust and loose dirt, and through the application of dry aromatic herbs, lavender, meadowsweet, and dried rosemary crushed and rubbed lightly into the weave or simply laid among the folds of a garment in storage, meant to counter whatever smell the fabric had already absorbed rather than remove its actual cause. A gown might be worn for weeks, sometimes months, between any real attempt at cleaning beyond this brushing, and across that stretch of time it steadily absorbed sweat, cooking, smoke, incense, spilled wine, and the accumulated smell of every room it had been worn through, all of it settling permanently into fibers that no herb, however fragrant, could ever fully lift back out again. The one genuine exception to this entire system was linen, the plain, undyed fabric, worn as the innermost layer against bare skin, the smocks and shirts and shifts that separated a person's actual body from everything worn over it. Linen absorbed sweat and body oil the way modern cotton does, and, unlike wool or velvet, it tolerated washing extremely well, which meant that a Tudor household's entire working theory of personal cleanliness rested on this single garment. Change the linen daily, or as close to daily, as a household's laundry capacity allowed, and the body beneath the unwashed outer layers was understood to be, in every sense the era actually recognized, properly clean. The outer garments simply were not expected to participate in that cleanliness at all. They were expected to look correct, to hold their shape and their color, and beyond that, very little. For Beatrice, this arrangement meant a wardrobe divided sharply into two entirely different categories of care. Her own gowns, modest by the Queen's standards, but still representing a considerable investment for a gentlewoman of her rank, were brushed each week by a junior servant assigned to the task, aired when weather allowed by hanging them near an open window for an hour or two, and refreshed with a small muslin bag of dried lavender tucked into the sleeve overnight, habit she had adopted from an older Spanish gentlewoman years earlier and never abandoned. Her linen, by contrast, went to the laundresses constantly, and she counted herself fortunate, in a quiet way she rarely examined too closely, that her position afforded her enough shifts in rotation that she was never forced to wear the same one 2 days running, an arrangement that women considerably lower in the household hierarchy, the chamberers and the kitchen girls, could rarely afford for themselves. She had grown so used to the particular ritual of her own dressing, linen fresh and cool against her skin each morning, the heavier wool gown settling over it, smelling faintly, always, of lavender, and the low, unplaceable warmth of a body that had worn it many times before, that she never once thought of herself as anything other than clean. By the standards she had been raised inside since childhood, she was. The broader context surrounding this system reveals just how directly cleanliness, in this era, tracked wealth rather than habit or discipline. A great household like the Queen's own maintained laundresses, working nearly full-time to keep linen in constant rotation, boiling it with wood ash and stale urine in the process contemporaries called bucking, then spreading it across hedges and open grass to dry and bleach in direct sunlight. A poorer household, without the means to employ laundresses or the linen stock to rotate through a proper wash cycle, may do with far less. Sometimes a single shift worn for a week or more at a stretch, simply because there was nothing spare to change into while the first one dried. The social historian Liza Picard has traced this exact pattern through surviving household inventories of the period, arguing that the number of shirts or smocks a person owned functioned, in real terms, as a far more accurate measure of their actual cleanliness than anything related to bathing. Since a household with a generous linen supply could present its members as reliably fresh regardless of how rarely anyone in it ever touched a tub of water. Catherine's own household, drawing on considerable Spanish and English resources both, sat near the very top of this scale, and the outer wool and velvet that never met water at all, sat in the era's own accounting, entirely outside the question of cleanliness altogether. A matter of correctness and display, rather than hygiene in any sense the household would have recognized the word. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns to what happened underneath all of that carefully brushed wool. The logic was practical. Once you accept the premises it was built on water as a genuine threat to costly fabric, linen as the one true instrument of cleanliness, herbs and brushing as a perfectly adequate maintenance for everything else. Beatrice did not consider her own wardrobe unwashed in any sense that troubled her, and neither did the Queen, whose own damask gowns, worn for state occasions across an entire season before being reworked or retired, carried exactly the same accumulated history of incense and sweat and spilled wine that every other gown at court carried, hidden under careful brushing and a folded sachet of lavender, entirely unremarkable to anyone who had grown up, as every single person in that household had, inside precisely this same understanding of what getting dressed actually required. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what actually happened to a body at this court, between the linen coming off at night and the fresh linen going on again the next morning, because the answer sits at an odd angle to almost everything a modern listener assumes. If you picture Catherine's ladies stepping into a tub of hot water each evening the way a modern person steps into a shower, you are picturing an activity that happened, for most of this household, perhaps a handful of times a year, and for reasons that had almost nothing to do with laziness or a simple absence of running water. The actual reality rests on the same humoral medicine that governed nearly every other decision this household made about the body. Skin, to a physician trained in the tradition, descended from Galen, was not the sealed barrier a modern mind pictures. It was porous, a membrane that opened under heat the way steam opens the grain of wood, and hot water was understood to force those pores wide enough to let the body's protective heat escape outward, while letting whatever floated in the surrounding air move inward directly into the blood. English physicians of the period held, almost without exception, that disease traveled on corrupted air, the invisible vapor rising from stagnant water, unburied waste, and crowded, poorly ventilated rooms, a belief historians call miasma theory, and a household of nearly 200 people packed into exactly the kind of close, rush-strewn quarters this hour has already described was, by the era's own reasoning, generating a considerable amount of that corrupted air every single day. Bathing in hot water during an ordinary week already carried modest, accepted risk. Bathing in a household this crowded, with the memory of the sweating sickness that had swept through England as recently as 1517 still fresh in nearly everyone's mind, struck most of the Queen's household as a risk simply not worth taking, whatever comfort a full bath might otherwise have offered. What filled the gap instead was a technique historians now call dry washing, and it was neither casual nor rare. Each morning, a gentlewoman like Beatrice would take a length of clean linen cloth and rub it briskly across her bare skin, throat, arms, chest, and back. The friction itself doing real physical work, since linen draws oil and sweat away from skin remarkably well. And the vigorous rubbing loosened the outer layer of grime enough for the cloth to carry it away entirely. Contemporary accounts describe the skin afterward as glowing faintly pink and warm to sensation, the era sincerely considered a mark of health rather than a poor substitute for anything, evidence that the humours had been stirred and refreshed without ever exposing a single open pore to dangerous air. Rosewater, kept in small stoppered flasks throughout the Queen's chambers, was used to dampen the cloth slightly for the hands, throat, and face, the small exposed areas everyone agreed carried little of the risk a full soak carried, while the torso and limbs were worked entirely dry. For Beatrice, This ritual opened nearly every morning of her adult life, performed quickly and automatically in the narrow space beside her straw pallet before the rest of the outer chamber fully woke around her. She kept her own length of rubbing cloth folded inside a small chest at the foot of her pallet, distinct from the linen she wore, laundered separately by one of the household's junior chamberers who understood, without ever being told twice, which cloths belonged to which purpose. There was a brisk, almost bracing quality to the ritual that Beatrice had come to truly look forward to, closer to a vigorous toweling after exertion than to any sense of neglect, and she had long since stopped thinking of it as anything other than simply washing, where a modern person does not think of a shower. Truer form of cleanliness. Her last full bath, taken the previous autumn at the advice of the household's physician during a stretch of unusually raw weather that he judged safe for it, had left her with a headache she privately blamed, exactly as her physician did, on the shock of the hot water to a body more accustomed to managing itself through dry means. The broader context here reveals just how deliberately this system had been reasoned out, rather than simply improvised in the absence of anything better. The living historian Ruth Goodman spent 3 months in the early 2000s living according to reconstructed Tudor hygiene practices, avoiding anything a 16th century physician would have considered dangerous, and found that the people working closely beside her every day never once complained. That finding matters considerably here, because it demonstrates that a household avoiding full immersion in water for months at a stretch was not, as a modern assumption tends to suggest, simply going unwashed and hoping nobody minded. It had built an entire alternative method of managing the body, one considered by every physician and every gentlewoman practicing it to be both effective and considerably safer than the alternative. The historian Giles Tremlett, whose biography of Catherine draws extensively on the surviving Spanish and English household records of exactly this period, has noted that the Queen's own devotion to what contemporaries considered scrupulous personal cleanliness was remarked upon favorably by more than one visiting ambassador. Practiced with real diligence, was entirely capable of producing a household that struck outside observers as thoroughly well kept, whatever a modern nose might have made of the same rooms. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular ritual into everything that follows. The absence of a bathtub in nearly every room of Catherine's household was not an absence of care. It was the visible shape of a specific coherent fear, reasoned out carefully by physicians working with the best tools their century had given them, and practiced daily, without complaint, by every single person living inside its logic. Beatrice did not feel herself to be avoiding anything each morning as she worked that dry cloth briskly across her own skin. She felt herself to be taking care of her body in precisely the way a sensible person managed a body in a dangerous world. And in this, she was no different from the Queen she served, or from the physician attending them both, from nearly everyone else in England still decades away from any reason to believe the water itself had never really been the danger at all. Which brings us to the question nobody at this court ever asked directly, though every single person living inside it was quietly managing the answer all day long. What actually happened when 200 people, none of them with anything resembling a private bathroom, needed to relieve themselves inside a stone palace with no plumbing beyond a handful of primitive drains, and needed to do it constantly, discreetly, and without ever drawing the kind of attention that a queen's household could not afford to draw? The actual reality is a system considerably more organized than the word chamber pot alone suggests, though the chamber pot sat at the center of it. Every room of any real status in the palace, from the Queen's own bedchamber down through the gentlewomen's shared quarters, kept at least one close stool or plain earthenware pot, often tucked into a small closet, or simply set discreetly behind a curtain. The Queen's own close stool, padded wooden seat built over a removable pewter or pottery vessel, sat in a small closet off her bedchamber, attended by a servant whose entire formal position, the groom of the stool, existed for exactly this single purpose and ranked at the King's own court as one of the most intimate and trusted appointments a monarch could grant. Catherine's own household maintained an equivalent arrangement on a slightly smaller scale. One or two women whose specific responsibility included managing that closet, keeping the vessel emptied, and ensuring it never became the kind of embarrassment that a foreign ambassador touring the Queen's apartments. Twice a day, as a matter of settled household routine, these vessels were carried down by the servants responsible for them and emptied into the open courtyards and designated pits that every great Tudor palace maintained for exactly this purpose. Waste that was periodically cleared by laborers hired specifically for the task and carted away from the palace grounds entirely. The system worked after a fashion, though it worked considerably better in theory than in the crowded reality of a household running at full capacity during the spring of 1520, with extra staff already arriving in preparation for the journey to Calais, and every existing arrangement for waste, water, and space stretched that much further than usual. Lower servants without access to the Queen's own more carefully managed closets relied on shared vessels kept in communal areas, or, when the household travelled and formal arrangements broke down entirely, on whatever corner of a courtyard or field offered enough discretion to manage the matter quickly. The historian Lucy Worsley, writing about the physical realities of royal households in this period, has described the management of human waste as one of the genuine, unglamorous engineering challenges facing any court this size. Done remarked labor, rather than through any technology modern visitor would recognize as sanitation. Bodily function extended for the women of this household into a second, equally unremarked category of management that the surviving records touch on even more obliquely, since almost nobody in this era wrote directly about menstruation. What the fragmentary evidence does suggest, drawn from later medical texts, and the plain logic of what materials were actually available, is that women managed menstrual blood with washable linen rags, folded and secured, laundered discreetly and repeatedly, rather than discarded. An approach that placed yet another quiet demand on the same linen supply and the same laundresses already stretched thin, managing shirts, smocks, and bed linen for nearly 200 people. For a gentlewoman like Beatrice, this meant a private, unspoken calculation each month about her own small store of cloth, timed carefully around whatever duties the coming days demanded of her, since a long ceremonial occasion, hours spent standing beside the Queen in a formal gown with no opportunity to step away unnoticed, required a kind of quiet advance planning that never appeared in any household account, and never needed to. For Beatrice specifically, the daily management of all of this bodily reality had become, across 19 years of service, a set of habits so automatic she rarely thought about them as effort at all. She knew precisely which hour of the morning offered the best window to use the shared closet, before the outer chamber woke fully around her. She kept her own small store of clean rags folded discreetly at the bottom of her linen chest, and she had learned, the way every woman in that household learned to read the Queen's own small signals. A particular pause, a glance toward a lady positioned nearest the door. That meant Catherine herself required a moment of privacy, arranged quickly and without any visible fuss. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more demanding forms of attentiveness her position required, invisible almost by definition, since the entire point of doing it well was that nobody beyond the small circle of women managing it would ever notice it happening at all. The broader context surrounding this entire unglamorous machinery reveals something worth pausing on about how differently Tudor society drew the line between public and private than a modern household does. A great household's waste management was not treated as a shameful secret so much as an ordinary working fact of scale, managed by dedicated staff, tracked in accounts, and considered by anyone actually responsible for it a legitimate and even prestigious appointment. Since proximity to a monarch's most private moments was itself a form of trust that translated directly into influence. Menstruation, by contrast, sat considerably further outside what any contemporary record was willing to discuss openly, managed almost entirely within a closed circle of women, passed down as working knowledge from one gentlewoman to the next, rather than written into any surviving household ordinance. The gap between how openly this era documented one kind of bodily necessity and how thoroughly it silenced the other tells its own quiet story about whose bodily functions this culture considered worth formally organizing around, and whose it simply expected women to manage privately, competently, and without any acknowledgement at all. There is something worth sitting with here before this hour turns to the physicians who oversaw every other aspect of this household's relationship with its own bodies. The management of waste and blood inside Catherine's household required real, constant, carefully coordinated labor, performed almost entirely by women whose names appear nowhere in the formal record of this reign, and performed with enough quiet competence that the Queen herself, gliding through her own state apartments in pearled damask, never had to think about any of it at all. That invisibility was not an accident. It was the entire point of the labor, and it was, in its own unglamorous way, one of the most demanding jobs. For Beatrice, and for every other body inside this household, the ultimate authority on all of it, the crowding, the wool, the water, the vessels carried down twice a day, belonged to the Queen's physicians, and understanding how they actually thought about a sick or simply unbalanced body changes the picture of this household considerably. If you imagine Tudor medicine as a kind of well-meaning guesswork, physicians reaching for whatever seemed to help without any real system behind it, you are picturing something considerably less organized and considerably less confident than what Catherine's own doctors actually practiced. The actual reality is a complete, internally consistent medical system inherited from Galen and refined across more than 1,000 years of Islamic and European scholarship, resting on the conviction that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each associated with its own qualities of heat and moisture, and that nearly every illness represented an imbalance among them that a skilled physician could diagnose and correct. Bloodletting sat at the center of this system's practical toolkit, and it was not performed casually or on a patient's whim. It followed a calendar drawn from physicians' almanacs that mapped the moon's position against the zodiac and against the specific parts of the body. Each sign was believed to govern, since the humors themselves were understood to rise and fall in sympathy with the moon. And a vein opened at the wrong lunar phase risk drawing blood the body could not safely spare, while the same procedure performed at the correct moment was believed to restore balance with real, measurable benefit. A physician attending a great household like Catherine's would have consulted exactly this kind of calendar before recommending bloodletting for any of the Queen's attendants and the household's own accounts, though they rarely name individual servants. The tradesmen who performed the actual cutting under a physician's direction for exactly this service across the year. Forced vomiting served a parallel purpose for complaints that suggested an excess of corrupted matter sitting in the stomach rather than the blood. Induced through emetic preparations, a physician or apothecary compounded from ingredients ranging from mild herbal infusions, prescribed for anything from a minor fever to the general sluggishness that followed too rich a meal at a feast. The physician Andrew Boord, who would publish England's first printed guide to healthy living, his Dietary of Health, some 2 decades after this particular spring, set down in careful, systematic detail. Since Board was recording generations of accumulated university medical training rather than inventing anything new. A minor fever, in this framework, was rarely treated with rest alone. It was treated as a diagnostic puzzle, a specific humoral imbalance to be identified, and then corrected through bleeding, purging, or a careful adjustment of diet. And a physician who simply told a patient to wait it out would have struck Catherine's own household as considerably less competent than one who intervened with real, active treatment. For a gentlewoman like Beatrice, this meant that even an ordinary winter cold or a stretch of unusual tiredness carried the real possibility of a physician's visit and a recommended bleeding, an experience she had undergone perhaps half a dozen times across her years at court, always at the barber surgeon's careful hands. A small vein opened at the inside of the elbow, and a measured amount of blood drawn into a shallow bowl. While she sat still and watched the color of it, pale or dark, red or thin, the way the physician himself watched it, both of them reading the same evidence through entirely different eyes. She had come to associate the procedure with a specific, familiar kind of tiredness afterward, a heaviness in the limbs she now recognized instantly, and had long since stopped finding alarming since every other woman in the household who underwent the same treatment described feeling exactly the same way, evidence to her mind and to the physicians both. That the treatment was doing precisely what it was meant to do. She did not question whether the bleeding itself might be the actual cause of that heaviness rather than its cure. Nobody in her century had any reason to ask that particular question. The broader context surrounding the system reveals just how completely structured daily life for everyone inside a great household, servant and monarch alike. Catherine herself, whose chronic health complaints across her adult life included irregular and often painful cycles, recurring headaches, and periods of what contemporaries describe simply as heaviness of spirit, was bled regularly by her own personal physicians according to the same lunar logic. A fact recorded in fragments in the diplomatic correspondence of ambassadors who took a close professional interest in the Queen's health as a matter of considerable political importance, since an heir depended on it. The historian David Loades, whose work on the structure of the Tudor royal household remains a standard reference for exactly this kind of question, has emphasized that a monarch's physicians operated under enormous pressure to be seen doing something in the face of any complaint, however minor. Since a passive response to a queen's ill health could itself be read as negligence bordering on treason, a servant's bleeding carried lower stakes, but the identical logic, treatment as an active, visible demonstration of care rather than a passive wait for symptoms to resolve on their own. And a household running on this logic bled and purged its members with a regularity that would strike a modern reader as alarming, and struck nearly everyone actually living inside it as simple, sensible medicine. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this chapter of the household's daily rhythm. The physicians attending Catherine's court were not guessing, and they were not indifferent to suffering. They were applying, with real skill and real seriousness, the most sophisticated medical system their century had produced, tracking the moon, reading the color of drawn blood, weighing diet against humor with the same careful attention a modern physician gives to a blood test. It happened to be built on a foundation that would not survive scientific scrutiny for another 3 centuries. And in the meantime, it left Beatrice and every other body in that crowded household a little paler, a little more tired, and considerably more familiar with the inside of a barber surgeon's bowl than any of them had particular reason to want. For Beatrice, everything this hour has described so far, the crowding, the unwashed wool, the bleeding calendar, was simply the shared condition of the household she served. What she alone, along with 2 or 3 of the Queen's very closest women, actually witnessed on certain nights of the week, belonged to a considerably more private category of suffering, one the Queen herself had gone to real, deliberate lengths to keep hidden from almost everyone, including, as far as anyone in the household could tell, her own husband. If you picture the private devotions of a 16th century queen, you probably picture something dignified and comfortable, a woman kneeling briefly at a cushioned prie-dieu before bed perhaps, murmuring a few familiar prayers before retiring to a warm, well-appointed room. What actually happened behind the closed door of Catherine's private oratory several nights a week bore almost no resemblance to that comfortable picture, and the small handful of women who assisted her understood, without ever being told so directly, that discussing it outside that room was simply not something a person in their position did. The actual reality is that Katherine of Aragon, Queen of England, wore next to her own skin, beneath every layer of damask and pearl this hour has already described, a garment of coarse, undyed horsehair cloth, a hair shirt, the traditional instrument of penance worn by members of religious orders devoted to bodily mortification as a discipline of the spirit. Katherine had been received years earlier as a member of the Third Order of St. Francis, a lay affiliation open to married men and women who wished to live according to a modified version of Franciscan discipline while continuing their ordinary lives in the world, and the hair shirt, along with a program of fasting considerably stricter than the Church formally required of anyone in her position, formed part of the devotional practice she had carried with her since girlhood in Spain, where her own mother, Isabella of Castile, had modeled precisely this kind of severe, unshowy piety across an entire reign spent almost constantly at war. The historian Giles Tremlett, whose biography draws on the fullest surviving range of Spanish and English sources for Catherine's life, describes this devotion as entirely genuine rather than performed, a private discipline she maintained with real consistency across decades rather than a fashionable gesture adopted for a season. Several nights a week, once the Queen's most public duties for the day had finally concluded, she withdrew to a small private oratory attached to her bedchamber, and there, with only one or two of her most trusted women present to assist and to keep watch at the door, she knelt on the bare stone floor for a considerable stretch of time in prayer, often removing the hair shirt only to replace it with a fresh one, since the garment itself, worn constantly against unwashed skin already carrying the accumulated sweat of a full day under damask and boning, required its own regular rotation. The stone underneath her knees was not softened by any cushion during these hours. Contemporary accounts from those who observed Catherine's devotional habits across her life describe knees left raw and, on the more severe nights, visibly bleeding by the time she finally rose, an intentional feature of the practice rather than an unfortunate side effect of it, since physical discomfort was understood as the entire point, a deliberate offering of bodily suffering meant to unite the one praying more closely with the suffering of Christ. For Beatrice, being one of the small number of women trusted to assist the Queen through these private hours was among the most demanding and most carefully guarded responsibilities of her entire position, considerably more delicate than anything involving linen or chamber vessels, because it required a silence extending well beyond the room itself. She had learned, early in her service, precisely how to prepare a fresh hair shirt without comment, how to help the Queen rise from stone that had left her legs stiff and unsteady without ever suggesting, by word or expression, that anything about the ritual struck her as remarkable. On the rare occasion another servant asked what kept the Queen occupied so late into certain evenings with an answer, vague enough to satisfy curiosity without ever actually describing what she had seen. She had come to feel across the years she had spent kneeling near that door keeping watch while the Queen prayed, something considerably more complicated than simple duty, a private, unspoken admiration for a devotion so total that its owner had never once, in Beatrice's hearing, sought any acknowledgement or sympathy for it at all. The broader context surrounding this practice reveals a dimension of Tudor religious life easy for a modern viewer to miss entirely. Since public prayer and public charity, The kind of piety visible in a portrait or a chronicler's flattering account survived far more richly in the historical record than anything a person deliberately concealed. The historian Eamon Duffy, whose scholarship has reshaped much of how historians now understand devotional practice in this exact period, has written extensively about the wide, largely undocumented range of private penitential practice among the pious laity of early Tudor England, noting that hair shirts private fasting beyond formal church requirement, and deliberately uncomfortable prayer positions appear, where they appear at all in the surviving record, almost exclusively through the kind of second-hand testimony this household's own women eventually provided, since the entire tradition prized concealment as a spiritual discipline. The theological principle that true penance performed for outside recognition lost most of its actual value. Catherine's own confessors throughout her life were drawn from the observant Franciscans, the stricter Reformed branch of the order, men whose entire vocation was built around exactly this severe, unshowy model of devotion, and her practice sat squarely within a recognized, respected tradition. There is something worth sitting with here, before this hour turns to a considerably more public form of suffering entirely. The Queen who processed through Greenwich each morning in pearled damask, composed and serene enough that visiting ambassadors wrote home describing her dignity in glowing, unqualified terms, was several nights a week a woman kneeling alone on bare stone with blood on her knees, watched only by one or two women sworn to a silence they kept for the rest of their lives. She was not the porcelain figure in the paintings. She was a woman managing an entire private architecture of belief and discomfort that had nothing to do with how she wished to be seen, and everything to do with a faith she had carried, unbroken, across an ocean and 2 decades of English winters, and had never once, as far as the surviving record allows us to know, considered performing for anyone at all. The smell alone would tell you something was different the moment you crossed from the Queen's own apartments into the working heart of the palace kitchens, because a household feeding close to 200 people twice a day, sometimes 3 times when the court entertained, and considerably more improvisational than the elegant banquets depicted in later paintings of Tudor feasting ever suggest. If you picture a royal kitchen in 1520, you probably picture abundance without complication, whole roasted meats carried in on silver, spices used freely simply because a wealthy household could afford them, every dish arriving at the table in a state of straightforward freshness that modern refrigeration makes almost impossible to imagine going without. The actual reality facing Catherine's kitchen staff was considerably more constrained and considerably more skillful than that picture allows, because keeping meat, fish, and dairy edible across the gap between slaughter or catch and the moment it finally reached a plate was one of the genuine, unglamorous engineering problems of feeding a household this size in an age with no reliable way to keep anything cold beyond a deep cellar, ice harvested and stored in winter for as long as it lasted, and the honest hope that a given cut of meat had not traveled too far or sat too long before it reached the spit. The actual system built to manage this problem rested heavily on salt, smoke, and spice, each performing real, useful work rather than simply decorating a dish for the sake of luxury. Salted and smoked meats formed the backbone of the household's protein supply for much of the year, preserved through methods that worked well enough to prevent outright spoilage, but did very little to disguise the particular heavy taste that heavily salted or long-stored meat develops over time. Spices, imported at real expense from trade routes stretching toward the Mediterranean and beyond, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and the sweetened, thickened sauces Tudor cookery favored, served a genuine culinary purpose in masking exactly this kind of taste. Transforming a cut of mutton or beef that had sat rather longer than ideal into something the Queen's own table could plausibly serve without visible complaint. This was not, historians studying Tudor foodways are careful to note, a system built entirely around disguising outright rot, since a household of this rank generally had the resources to avoid truly spoiled meat reaching the queen's own table. But the margin between acceptable and questionable sat considerably closer. And a heavy hand with spice and rendered fat, some of it kept well past its own ideal freshness, did real, constant work in closing that gap for the household's ordinary daily meals below the queen's own most formal table. Rendered animal fat, kept in earthenware pots throughout the kitchen, and used liberally in nearly every dish, from the pastry crusts encasing meat pies to the sauces poured over roasted fowl, carried its own particular smell across the working areas of the palace. Faintly rancid note that settled into the wooden beams and stone walls of the kitchen wing, regardless of how carefully any individual pot was managed, since fat rendered from animal carcasses simply does not keep sweet indefinitely in a larder without any modern means of refrigeration. Processing carcasses and rendering fat continuously across the week could never entirely outrun the smell its own necessary work produced. The kitchen staff themselves, dozens of cooks, scullions, and turnspit boys working in close, hot, smoke-filled rooms for hours at a stretch, absorbed that smell into their own clothing and skin so thoroughly that a kitchen worker could often be identified by scent alone before they were ever seen. A fact contemporaries occasionally remarked on with the same unbothered matter-of-factness this hour has already applied to nearly everything else about this household. For Beatrice, whose duties kept her almost entirely within the Queen's own apartments rather than the working kitchens, the food itself arrived at several careful removes from its actual preparation, plated and sauced and presented with the same visual correctness. She had, across her years at court, developed a quiet habit of watching which dishes the Queen herself favored on a given evening, and which she left largely untouched, a small skill that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do. Since a physician attending the household paid close attention to exactly this kind of detail as evidence of the Queen's underlying humoral balance, Beatrice herself ate considerably plainer fare than what reached the Queen's own table: bread, pottage, and whatever meat the household's ordinary kitchens produced for its working staff, food prepared with less spice and considerably less ceremony. Though drawn from the identical larders and the identical uncertain margins between fresh and merely acceptable that govern the Queen's own more elaborate dishes, the broader context surrounding Tudor food preservation reveals just how much labor, skill, and genuine culinary sophistication went into managing a problem modern kitchens have simply engineered away. The food historian Ivan Day, whose reconstructions of Tudor and early modern cookery have become a standard reference for exactly this kind of question, has demonstrated through careful hands-on experiment that period recipes calling for heavy spicing were not, as an older and considerably lazier historical assumption, a simple matter of desperately covering up rot with whatever was on hand. They represented a real, sophisticated culinary tradition in their own right, balancing sweet, sour, and richly spiced flavors, according to the same humoral logic that governed medicine, since food itself was understood to carry its own heating, cooling, moistening, and drying qualities capable of adjusting a diner's internal balance, which meant that a heavily spiced dish was doing double duty, disguising whatever imperfection the meat itself carried while also actively working in the heir's own medical thinking to keep the person eating it in better humoral health. Lower households, without access to expensive imported spice, managed the identical preservation problem with considerably blunter tools. Salt alone, or simply eating meat and fish faster, within days of slaughter or catch, before spoilage became a genuine concern at all. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from the kitchens into everything else this hour has already described about this household's relationship with the body. Nearly every system this hour has walked through, the rushes, the wool, the bloodletting calendar, the spiced and salted meat, represented the same underlying pattern, a genuine, skilled, and often quite sophisticated human response to problems. Nobody at Catherine's court was eating carelessly, any more than anybody there was dressing carelessly or bathing carelessly. They were managing with real attention and real craft the actual limits of what their centuries' food, water, and medicine could offer them, and the fact that a modern palate would recognize the results as heavier, richer, and considerably more assertively flavored than anything we would call fresh today, says considerably more about how far food preservation has traveled since 1520 than it says about the skill of the people managing dinner for 200 people. For Beatrice, for every one of the roughly 200 people this household actually employed, the crowding, the wool, the bleeding, the hair shirt kept discreetly out of sight, the spiced and salted meat, all of it rested on a foundation of sheer physical labor. Running an establishment this size was not, whatever the finished appearance in the Great Hall might suggest, primarily a matter of ceremony. It was a matter of logistics, executed daily by hundreds of aching bodies, and overseeing that logistics fell, in real practical terms, to Maria de Salinas, Lady Willoughby, the one woman in this household whose actual documented life offers a clear, verifiable window. If you picture the management of a queen's household, you probably picture something closer to ceremony than to accounting. A senior lady in waiting concerned chiefly with precedence, seating, and the correct order of a procession, rather than with anything resembling a modern manager's daily headaches. Maria de Salinas, who had crossed to England with Catherine as a girl in the retinue that accompanied her nearly 2 decades earlier, and had remained closer to the Queen than any other woman at court, occupied a role considerably more demanding. By 1520, she held real authority within the household's day-to-day administration, and the position placed her squarely between the Queen's genuine needs and a crown treasury that did not always meet them on schedule. The actual reality of Catherine's finances during these years was considerably more precarious than her outward magnificence ever suggested. Her jointure and household allowance set by treaty and by royal grant did not always arrive with the reliability a household this size required to function smoothly, and the surviving correspondence around the Queen's finances in this period, fragmentary as it is, shows repeated evidence of strain, wages for household servants running behind, top provisioning accounts stretched thin, and difficult decisions about which expenses could wait and which could not be delayed without visible consequence to the Queen's own dignity. Maria de Salinas, entrusted with real responsibility for keeping this machinery running despite these constraints, managed a task considerably closer to modern crisis budgeting than to the leisured elegance a modern viewer tends to project onto the phrase lady in waiting. She negotiated with merchants for credit against future payment. She managed the delicate task of deciding which servants' wages could be delayed a week without provoking real hardship or real anger, and she did all of this while maintaining in every visible the same composed dignity the rest of the household was expected to project outward at all times. Beneath Maria's level of authority, the actual daily labor of keeping this household running fell to servants whose working days, by any honest modern accounting, ran to 16 hours or more. Water for cooking, washing, and the Queen's own occasional bath had to be carried up from wells and cisterns in heavy buckets, a task performed by the same lower servants who also hauled the oak logs that kept fires burning in dozens of separate hearths throughout the palace's working and living quarters. In a country this cold for much of the year, consumed firewood at a rate that required near constant replenishment. Chamber vessels, the pots and close stool basins this hour has already described, had to be carried down and emptied twice daily by servants who performed the task alongside everything else expected of them, and the sheer physical distance uncovered in a single day, up and down narrow backstairs, across long galleries, between kitchens and chambers, separated by considerable stretches of stone corridor, added a kind of constant, grinding physical toll that no single task on its own would fully explain. For Beatrice, specifically, the toll showed up most clearly the court. Greenwich, like every great stone palace of this period, was draughty by any modern standard, its thick walls holding damp and cold air through corridors that no amount of woven wall hanging could fully seal, and years of moving through those same corridors. One point in the same, relatively thin indoor clothing that court fashion demanded, regardless of the actual temperature, had left her with a persistent ache in her knees and lower back that she had, by 1520, simply come to accept as an ordinary feature of being 29. She was not unusual in this. The living historian Ruth Goodman, again drawing on her own extended physical experience reconstructing Tudor daily life, has written specifically about the toll that constant exposure to damp stone and cold draughts took on servants of this era. Describing chronic joint pain and what contemporaries would have recognized as rheumatism as an almost universal condition among household staff who spent their working lives moving between poorly heated stone rooms, a toll that fell hardest on the servants performing the most physically demanding tasks, rather than on the gentlewomen whose duties, while still exhausting, at least kept them closer to the Queen's own better heated apartments for much of the day. The broader context surrounding this labor reveals just how directly a household's outward grandeur depended on effort that its own polished self-presentation was specifically designed never to show. The historian Barbara Harris, whose work on the working lives of aristocratic and gentry women in this period has done considerable work to recover exactly the kind of labor this hour is describing, has argued that women like Maria de Salinas performed a genuine and largely unrecognized form of household governance, skilled and almost entirely invisible in the formal record a modern historian is left to work with, since the accounts that survive tend to record what was spent rather than the considerable skill required to stretch an insufficient sum across an entire household's genuine needs. Beneath her, the water carriers and wood haulers and vessel emptiers, who kept the physical machinery of the household actually running, appear in the surviving record hardly at all, named, if they are named at all, only in the barest wage entries. Their 16-hour days and their aching joints left entirely to inference and to the kind of careful reconstruction historians like Goodman have spent years assembling from what little physical and documentary evidence does survive. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns to what happened when any part of this vast, exhausted, carefully coordinated machinery actually failed. The magnificence of Catherine's household, the pearl damask, the incense, the composed stillness of a queen receiving an ambassador, rested entirely on the labor of people whose own bodies paid the visible, physical cost of producing that magnificence, and paid it day after day, without any expectation that the cost itself would ever be acknowledged. Maria de Salinas balanced impossible accounts with real skill. Beatrice and women like her carried water and vessels and endured the cold with a kind of quiet, practiced endurance that the historical record has never fully credited, and the queen who processed through her own halls in gold thread and pearls owed every step of that procession to labor she likely never once had cause to think about at all. For Beatrice, and for every gentlewoman standing anywhere near the Queen's person on a given day, the exhaustion this hour has already described sat beside a second, sharper kind of strain, one that had nothing to do with the body's own aches and everything to do with the constant, quiet vigilance this court demanded of anyone hoping to keep their place inside it. Which brings us to the question sitting underneath nearly every interaction inside this household. the one nobody needed to ask aloud, because everyone already understood the answer by instinct. What actually happened when a servant made a mistake in front of the wrong person? If you picture court discipline in this period, you probably picture something formal and slow, a system of warnings and second chances, not unlike a modern workplace, where a single misstep might draw a reprimand, but rarely anything more permanent than that. The actual reality facing a gentlewoman or a servant of any rank inside a royal household was considerably less forgiving and considerably faster, because a great household's entire value to the family it served rested on its reputation for order, discretion, and flawless presentation. And a single visible failure threatened that reputation in a way the household's leadership had every incentive to correct immediately and completely. The actual mechanics of this discipline are visible in the surviving household ordinances of the period, documents drawn up to govern exactly this kind of behavior across every great establishment in England, royal or noble. Cardinal Wolsey's own sweeping reform of the king's household, the Eltham Ordinances issued in January of 1526, just a handful of years after the spring this hour has centered on, set down in explicit written language the standards already governing households, like Catherine's own in practice, warning against the confusion and outright danger that could arise from careless or unsuitable persons being permitted too close to a monarch's own person. A servant found guilty of theft, of spreading gossip about the Queen's private affairs, of drunkenness severe enough to draw notice, or simply of a persistent carelessness that reflected badly on the household's good order, faced dismissal that could arrive within days rather than after any extended process of warning and review. And dismissal from a royal household carried consequences that reached considerably further than the simple loss of a position. A servant dismissed from Catherine's household under any cloud of disgrace lost not only her wages and her lodging, but very often her entire prospect of ever finding equivalent employment again, since every other great household in England drew, in one way or another, on the same small interconnected world, noble and gentry families. And word of a dismissal travelled through that world with real speed. For a gentlewoman whose family had spent real money and real political capital securing her a place at court in the first place, disgrace of this kind could permanently damage her own marriage prospects and her family standing alike, a fact every young woman entering service understood clearly from her very first week. For Beatrice, this reality had shaped nearly every visible habit of her adult life. The careful blankness she maintained during the Queen's private devotions, the discretion she practiced around the household's financial strain, the instinct developed over 19 years. She had watched, across her time at court, several other women lose their positions for infractions that struck her, in her own private judgment, as considerably smaller than the punishment that followed a gentlewoman dismissed for repeating, in what she had believed was a private conversation, to any offhand remark the Queen had made about a visiting ambassador, another sent home to her family in disgrace after a night steward reported her missing from her post for less than an hour. Beatrice had never once, in 19 years, allowed herself the kind of careless moment that had ended those other careers, not because she considered herself more virtuous than the women who had made those mistakes, but because she had understood from her very first months at court as a frightened girl of 10 that this particular household offered no real margin for error to anyone without an independent fortune or a powerful family name standing behind her. The specific tension of the spring this hour is centered on sharpen this vigilance considerably further, because the household's preparations for the journey to Calais that June, the field of cloth of gold, that would eventually stage the most lavish diplomatic spectacle either England or France had ever attempted, meant an unusually large number of new servants arriving to help manage the logistics of moving and housing an entire royal court in temporary lodgings on foreign soil. every one of those new arrivals represented, from the perspective of an established gentlewoman like Beatrice, both a genuine help and a genuine new source of risk, since a new servant, unfamiliar with the household's unspoken rules of discretion, could commit, entirely by accident, exactly the kind of visible mistake that reflected badly on everyone standing near her when it happened. Beatrice had spent a considerable portion of her spring quietly instructing several of these newer women in precisely the habits she herself had spent 19 years internalizing, not because anyone had formally assigned her the task, but because she understood, in the same instinctive way she understood, that the household's collective reputation depended on exactly this kind of unofficial, unpaid mentorship passing quietly from the experienced women to the new one. What makes this particular strain worth sitting with is what it did not produce, which is the kind of visible resentment or quiet sabotage a modern viewer might expect from a workforce operating under this much constant pressure. The broader context surrounding court discipline in this period reveals something the household ordinances alone cannot fully explain, which is the genuine, well-documented loyalty that women like Beatrice and Maria de Salinas maintained toward Catherine. Specifically, a loyalty that would eventually be tested far beyond anything this particular spring required of it, when the Queen's marriage came under open political attack later in the decade, and her household began shrinking under direct royal pressure to abandon her. The historian Julia Fox, whose work on the women of Catherine's circle has traced this loyalty in considerable detail, has argued that the discipline and danger inherent in court service, rather than eroding the bond between the Queen and her closest attendants, seems instead to have deepened it, since surviving the same daily pressures together. The crowding, the exhaustion, the constant risk of a single misstep ending a career, created a kind of shared endurance among these women that outlasted every reversal Catherine's fortunes. Maria de Salinas herself would eventually be formally ordered years later to leave the Queen's household entirely and forbidden from any further contact with her, an order she defied as completely as she was able, and would famously force her way to Catherine's bedside during the Queen's final illness, regardless of the personal risk involved in doing so. A loyalty that had its root in exactly this kind of daily, unglamorous, shared endurance this hour has spent so long describing. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular strain of the household's daily life. The discipline governing this court was real, and it was genuinely dangerous to a servant's entire future in a way a modern workplace rarely approaches. And critically, the women living inside that danger did not respond to it with the kind of guarded self-interest a modern viewer might expect. They built instead exactly the kind of quiet mutual instruction and shared vigilance Beatrice practiced with the household's newest arrivals that spring, a form of collective survival that the surviving formal record concerned chiefly with wages and dismissals, and that only becomes visible at all through the kind of careful reconstruction this hour has been attempting, chapter by chapter, since it first stepped past the gloves and pearls of a Queen's public mourning. Underneath every single thing this hour has already described, crowding, the wool, the bleeding, the hair shirt, the kitchens, the 16-hour days, the constant vigilance against a single career-ending mistake, sat a fear considerably larger than any of them individually, one that touched every person in this household regardless of rank. From the Queen herself, down to the lowest boy who carried water up the back stairs. It rarely needed to be spoken aloud that spring of 1520, because everyone inside those walls already understood it the way a person understands weather, a fact of the season rather than a topic requiring explanation. If you imagine the great dangers facing a Tudor household, you probably reach first for the plague, the disease whose name and reputation survived clearly enough into the modern imagination that a listener today can picture its rough outlines without much prompting. Plague was familiar to Catherine's household, understood in its broad shape even if not its actual cause, feared but at least recognizable. A known danger with a known name. The disease that actually haunted this particular household and this particular decade of English history was something considerably stranger, a sickness that had struck England 5 times since 1485 and would strike once more before it finally mysteriously disappeared from the historical record entirely by the middle of the century. A killer English physicians could neither reliably explain nor reliably treat, and one that, unlike plague, barely touched anywhere else in Europe at all. The actual reality of the sweating sickness, as it was known to everyone in Catherine's household, was its terrifying speed. A person could rise in perfect health, be seized within hours by an overwhelming sense of dread, then chills, then a headache and an aching in the limbs severe enough to make walking difficult, and then break into a drenching, uncontrollable sweat that soaked through clothing and bedding alike, all of it unfolding across a single day, sometimes resolving itself within 24 hours in one direction or the other, either a slow recovery or, with genuine and well-documented frequency, a sudden failure of the heart that left a healthy young courtier dead before evening who had eaten breakfast in perfect health that same morning. The outbreak of 1517, 3 years before the spring this hour is centered on, remained vivid in the memory of nearly everyone in Catherine's household, close enough in time that servants who had lived through it still spoke of specific names, a groom who had died within a single afternoon, a laundress who had recovered only after days everyone had assumed would end in her death, and physicians who had watched patients who tore off their protective blankets partway through the illness, unable to bear the prescribed heat any longer, die within the hour of doing so. A pattern that only reinforced the belief that the sweat had to be endured to its full, agonizing course, rather than interrupted at any stage. Physicians attending Catherine's household, working from the same humoral framework that governed every other medical decision this hour has already described, understood the sweat as a violent expulsion of corrupted matter, forced out through the skin, most likely through the very air surrounding it. This belief connected the sweat directly to the same fear of hot water and open pores that kept the household's tubs largely empty, and it connected just as directly to the miasma theory governing the crowded, poorly ventilated quarters this hour opened by describing. Unmoving air, night after night, represented by the physician's own reasoning, exactly the kind of environment where corrupted vapor could accumulate and spread fastest. The prescribed response to any suspected case involved wrapping the patient tightly and keeping them dangerously warm, on the theory that the sweat needed to run its complete course alongside a household-wide vigilance about closed windows, sweet-burning herbs, and small-scented pomanders carried in a sleeve or pressed to the nose when crossing any particularly close or crowded stretch of corridor, precautions Beatrice and every other woman in the household had long since folded into their daily routines so thoroughly that none of them experienced the habit as fear exactly, simply as ordinary. Sensible caution against a danger everyone agreed was real. For Beatrice specifically, the memory of 1517 carried a weight considerably more personal than household gossip alone would suggest, since one of the original Spanish women who had crossed with her on that same voyage nearly 2 decades earlier had died of the sweat that same outbreak. Her woman Beatrice had known since childhood and had shared a pallet with for years before the sickness took her within a single terrible afternoon. She had never spoken of this loss to anyone at court beyond a brief formal mention in the earliest weeks after it happened, and she carried, in the years since, a private, watchful habit of monitoring her own body for the earliest signs the sickness was said to announce itself with a slight headache noticed with more attention than it likely deserved. A moment of unusual tiredness turned over carefully in her mind before she allowed herself to dismiss it as nothing. She was not unusual in this. Every servant in that crowded household carried some version of the identical private vigilance, a body watched constantly for betrayal by an illness nobody could see coming, and nobody could reliably survive once it arrived. The broader context surrounding this fear reveals just how directly it shaped the physical architecture of daily life inside Catherine's household, beyond even the precautions this hour has already named. Modern researchers, working from the surviving descriptions of the sweat symptoms and its strange sudden progression, still cannot agree with full confidence on what the disease actually was in modern medical terms, though a hantavirus, a pathogen carried by rodents and spread through contaminated dust or waste, remains among the leading theories, precisely because it would explain both the disease's near total confinement to England and its eventual disappearance once the animal population carrying it presumably shifted or declined. What is not in dispute is the disease's documented tendency to strike hardest among the young and outwardly healthy, the exact population making up most of Catherine's own household, and this tendency gave the household's constant unspoken vigilance. The historian Polydore Virgil, an Italian scholar resident in England during this exact period and a close observer of the English court, recorded the sweat's terrifying unpredictability in his own contemporary history of the kingdom, describing a disease that seemed to select its victims, striking the strong as readily as the frail, and leaving survivors with no clear understanding of why they, rather than the person beside them, had been spared. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this fear into everything this hour has already walked through together. The crowding that packed Beatrice's straw pallet close against two other sleeping women, the shut windows, the pomanders, the careful watch kept over the Queen's own health and every servant's besides, none of it was born of simple ignorance or excessive caution for its own sake. It was born of a household that had watched the sweat take people it knew personally more than once within living memory, and had built, out of the best medical understanding available to it, an entire careful architecture of vigilance against a danger that was entirely, verifiably real, even if the specific mechanism behind it would remain genuinely mysterious for another 5 centuries. Fear, inside this household, was not a weakness anyone apologized for. It was simply the accurate, reasonable response of people who had already buried friends to a disease nobody yet understood, and who had no real choice but to keep living, working, and sleeping inside its shadow regardless. For Beatrice, that shadow followed her most closely at the exact hour a modern listener would expect to offer the day's only real relief, the hour when the household's endless labor finally paused and its exhausted bodies were, at last, permitted to lie down. If you picture rest at this court, you probably picture something restorative, a warm bed at the end of a long day, sleep functioning the way it functions for a modern body, a genuine reset before the next morning's demands begin again. What actually happened once the candles were finally allowed to gutter out in Catherine's household was considerably less restful than that comfortable picture suggests, and understanding why reveals one more layer of the same careful, exhausting management this entire hour has been describing. The actual reality of sleep at this court divided as sharply along the lines of rank as everything else this hour has already covered. The Queen's own bed was a genuine luxury by any standard of the age, a heavy carved frame strung with rope and layered with a feather mattress deep enough to sink into, hung with thick curtains that could be drawn fully closed, against draughts and against the low light of a banked fire, and warmed, before she ever climbed into it, by a metal pan filled with hot coals, run briskly between the sheets by a servant assigned to exactly this task each night. Beatrice's own straw pallet, laid across the floor of the outer chamber, a few feet from that same curtained bed, offered nothing resembling this comfort. straw compressed within weeks into something considerably thinner and lumpier than its first fresh layer, and a household maintaining genuine standards replaced it perhaps twice a year, which meant that for long stretches at a time, Beatrice slept on bedding that had gone flat and faintly sour with the accumulated warmth of her own body. On an unglamorous discomfort, she had long since learned to simply stop noticing, the way she had learned to stop noticing most of what her position required her to endure without comment. Warmth itself was a genuine nightly negotiation rather than a given. Fires were banked rather than left burning through the night in nearly every room beyond the Queen's own bedchamber, both as a matter of expense, since firewood at this scale did not come cheaply even to a royal household, and as a matter of real, well-founded fear, since an unwatched fire in a building constructed largely of timber wall hangings and dry rushes represented a danger every household of this period took with total seriousness. Beatrice and the other women sleeping in the outer chamber relied instead on layered wool blankets, kept near enough to the Queen's own better heated bedchamber that some warmth carried through the connecting door, and on the simple, practical trick of sleeping close enough to one another that shared body heat did real work against a stone building's persistent chill. Bedbugs and lice, though rarely discussed directly in any surviving household record, appear consistently enough in the physical remedies period. Apothecaries kept in stock sachets of pennyroyal and wormwood meant to be tucked under bedding to suggest that Beatrice's nights were rarely troubled by cold alone. Physicians of the period took sleep considerably more seriously than a modern reader might expect from a medical system still centuries away from any real understanding of its biological function. Within the same humoral framework governing every other aspect of this household's health, sleep was understood as a genuine regimen requirement, alongside diet, exercise, and evacuation, one of what university-trained physicians called the 6 non-naturals. Too little sleep was believed to leave the body's natural heat depleted and its humors dangerously unsettled, while too much invited the opposite danger, an excess of moist, cold phlegm accumulating unchecked. A physician attending Catherine's household would have taken genuine professional interest in the Queen's own sleeping patterns, particularly during the stretches when her chronic headaches left her unable to rest properly for days at a time, and would have prescribed specific remedies: warmed wine infused with soporific herbs like poppy or lettuce seed, meant to correct the imbalance. Sleeplessness itself was believed to both cause and reveal. For Beatrice, the exhaustion of a 16-hour day meant that sleep, however uncomfortable the straw underneath her, generally came quickly once she finally lay down, though she had learned across 19 years to sleep lightly enough that the Queen's own slightest movement in the next room would wake her instantly. Her skill so deeply trained into her body by 1520 that it had begun on the rare nights she slept anywhere else to wake her at sounds that meant nothing at all outside that specific chamber. She rose again well before dawn most mornings, the whole cycle beginning immediately once more, and she had come, across the years, to think of the handful of hours between lying down and rising again not as rest in any full sense, but simply as the day's one brief pause, a trough between two long stretches of labor rather than any genuine recovery from either of them. The broader context surrounding sleep in this period reveals just how thoroughly rank-shaped even the most basic, universal human need. The historian Sasha Handley, whose scholarship on sleep in early modern England has done considerable work to recover exactly this kind of overlooked daily experience, has argued that a household's sleeping arrangements functioned as a direct, visible expression of its internal hierarchy, warmth, privacy, distributed in careful proportion to rank rather than to need, so that the person doing the most physically exhausting labor during daylight hours very often received the least genuine restoration once night finally came. Beatrice's own body absorbed this imbalance the same way it absorbed every other cost this hour has described, without complaint, and without any expectation that the arrangement might ever run the other way. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour finally steps back to consider what all of it, taken together, actually reveals. Even sleep, the one part of the day a modern mind assumes should belong entirely to the person experiencing it, was shaped at this court by exactly the same hierarchy governing everything else. Warmth for the queen and cold for her servants, a curtained feather bed for one body and a flattened straw pallet for another only a few feet away. Beatrice closed her eyes each night inside that same careful architecture of rank and endurance this entire hour has been describing, and woke again each morning to begin it once more, and did this without any real alternative available to her for 19 years. For Catherine's own gentlewoman, meanwhile, the spring of 1520 carried its own particular pressure entirely. Since everything this hour has already described, the crowding, the careful dry washing, the rotated linen, the discipline that could end a career overnight, existed in service of a single recurring performance. The moment a foreign visitor was actually admitted into the Queen's presence and asked to carry an account of what he had seen back to his own government. Understanding what that specific performance actually required reveals just how deliberately this entire household had been built, from its rushes to its rehearsed silences, around the demands of exactly this audience. If you picture a foreign ambassador's visit to a Tudor queen, you probably picture a fairly simple transaction, a formal greeting, an exchange of diplomatic pleasantries, and a report home describing more or less what the visitor actually witnessed. The actual reality of these visits involved a household mobilized well in advance, every detail of the Queen's presentation checked and rechecked, because the letters an ambassador sent home carried genuine political weight. A queen's health, her apparent contentment in her marriage, the order and discipline of her household. All of it fed directly into the diplomatic calculations of foreign courts, weighing England's stability and the strength of its royal marriage. That a visiting Venetian or Spanish envoy's private letter home might shape decisions considerably larger than anything discussed aloud during the visit itself. The actual mechanics of managing this scrutiny fell to the same women this hour has already spent so long describing. Beatrice and her fellow gentlewomen ensured that any visible sign of the household's daily strain, exhaustion, cold, the ordinary friction of 200 people living in close crowded quarters, simply never reached a visitor's notice, confined instead to the private chambers. The Queen's own damask and pearls, brushed and aired and mended with the same careful attention this hour described earlier, were reserved and rotated specifically around these occasions, worn only when a visitor of real consequence required the fullest possible display. Rushes in the rooms ambassador might actually pass through were changed with unusual thoroughness in the days before any planned visit, and incense burned more heavily than ordinary use required. A deliberate management of exactly the kind of smell this entire hour has spent so long describing, masked, on these particular occasions. Coordinated effort. This preparation carried particular weight in the spring of 1520, with the household already deep in the considerably larger project of readying itself for the journey to Calais that June. And, with the eyes of the French court, England's rival and host, already turned with real interest toward every report reaching them about the condition of Henry's marriage and his queen's own bearing. Surviving Venetian dispatches from earlier years of Catherine's reign, preserved in the detailed diplomatic archive known as the Calendar of State Papers, describe her repeatedly in terms of dignity, piety, and evident wifely devotion, praise that reflected genuine admiration. The considerable success of exactly the kind of careful household management this hour has just described. What those same ambassadors never saw and were never meant to see was any of the specific physical reality behind that dignity. The aching backs, the rotated straw, the hair shirt under the damask, or the quiet strain of a crown allowance that did not always arrive on schedule. It is this same gap between the visible household and its actual daily reality that would eventually draw the attention of Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador whose arrival in England in 1529, 9 years after this particular spring, this hour has already addressed directly. Once Chapuis took up his post and began the long, increasingly urgent work of defending Catherine's marriage against the king's determination to end it, he found himself relying out of genuine necessity on precisely the women this hour has spent so long following. Women who had served the Queen since the early 1522s, and who alone could tell him what the household's polished public face had spent a full decade successfully concealing from every previous foreign observer. His later dispatches to Emperor Charles V, considerably more detailed and considerably more sympathetic than anything the earlier Venetian and Spanish envoys had managed to record, exist in large part because the Queen's oldest attendants, worn down by years of exactly the strain this hour has described, finally had a sympathetic ear willing to listen and very little left to lose by speaking plainly to it. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular pressure into everything else this hour has already described. The household Beatrice served inside was never simply enduring its own daily hardship in private. It was actively, skillfully managing the gap between that hardship and the polished impression the outside world was permitted to see. A second, entirely invisible layer of labor stacked on top of every other burden this hour has already named. That the household succeeded so completely for so many years that visiting ambassadors wrote home describing nothing but order and serene dignity, stands as its own quiet testament to exactly how much skilled, coordinated effort a queen's household could produce when its own survival depended on the world outside its walls, never seeing anything else at all. Step back now for a moment from the particular rooms and the particular bodies this hour has spent so long moving through, and a handful of patterns begin to emerge from the accumulated detail, patterns that reach well beyond any single chamber pot or bleeding bowl or hidden hair shirt, and speak instead to something larger, and the century that built it actually was. The first pattern is this. What looks, from the safe distance of 5 centuries, like a household defined by filth and hardship, was in fact a household, running on an extraordinary amount of skilled, deliberate, and completely rational labor, applied daily by people who understood their circumstances. It would be easy, and it would be lazy, to look at the unwashed wool, the rush-strewn floors, and the twice-daily emptying of chamber vessels into open courtyards, and conclude that Tudor England simply had not yet worked out how to live cleanly, that the whole era shrugged at conditions a modern household would consider intolerable. Nothing in the actual record supports that reading. Every single system this hour has described, the dry washing ritual Beatrice performed each morning, the careful rotation of linen that stood in for the bathing nobody dared risk, the lunar calendar governing when a vein could safely be opened, the heavy spicing that turned uncertain meat into something a queen's table could serve without complaint, represented a genuine, considered solution to a genuine problem, built and maintained by people applying the best available knowledge of their century with real skill and real seriousness. The performance of order at this court was extraordinary. The daily machinery required to sustain it, considerably less glamorous and considerably more exhausting for the people actually running it. The second pattern concerns the body itself and the particular uncomfortable truth that this era did not, in any sense a modern viewer might expect, agree to pretend the body did not exist. If anything, the body was the single most closely managed subject running underneath this household's entire daily rhythm, discussed in every physician's visit, weighed in every decision about diet and bloodletting, watched constantly for the earliest sign that the sweat had finally arrived. What this era agreed to manage with discretion was not the body's existence, but its vulnerability and its private suffering. The itch nobody mentioned, the ache in Beatrice's knees she never once raised with the household physician, the raw and bleeding knees Katherine herself carried beneath damask that no ambassador's dispatch was ever meant to describe. The body, at this court, was constantly present and constantly discussed. What stayed hidden was never the fact of a body's needs, but the specific, individual cost any single person paid to meet them. The third pattern concerns the sheer scale of what this household actually required to keep functioning at all, a scale easy to lose sight of when the story narrows down to a single gentlewoman's straw pallet or a single physician's bleeding bowl. Consider what actually had to happen correctly every single day for Katherine of Aragon to appear before an ambassador in a gown that drew no comment beyond admiration. Laundresses had to manage a constant rotation of linen through a multi-day cycle of lye, boiling water, and sun bleaching. An apothecary had to keep the household supplied with imported spice, dried herb, and the specific ingredients a physician's bloodletting calendar might call for on any given week. Water carriers had to haul buckets up narrow stairs dozens of times a day, and wood haulers had to keep dozens of separate hearths burning through a cold English spring. Maria de Salinas had to stretch an unreliable royal allowance across genuine, urgent household needs without ever allowing that strain to become visible to anyone outside the small circle managing it. None of this happened by accident, and very little of it happened easily. It was an entire supporting economy, built to produce a single sustained impression of effortless royal dignity, and the fact that the impression succeeded, that ambassadors really did write home, describing Katherine's household as a model of good order and serene piety, says considerably more about the skill of the people running that economy than it says about anything simple or automatic in the household itself. The fourth pattern is the one most worth sitting with before this hour turns. Finally, back to the image it opened inside, because it is the pattern that connects everyone this hour has described, queen and gentlewoman and water carrier alike, into something considerably more unified than their different ranks might initially suggest. Every single person in this household, from Katherine kneeling alone on stone, through the private hours of her own devotion to Beatrice counting herself to sleep in a language she rarely spoke aloud anymore, was managing an enormous private cost that the household's public face was specifically constructed never to show. Queen's hair shirt and the servant's aching back were not, in any obvious sense, the same kind of suffering. One was chosen, a deliberate spiritual discipline, undertaken in pursuit of a faith Katherine held with total sincerity. The other was simply the unavoidable physical toll of a body performing 16 hours of labor a day inside a cold stone building. But both were carried silently by design, and both were understood by the person carrying them as simply the ordinary cost of the position they held, not worth mentioning, and certainly not worth complaining about, because everyone around them was managing some comparable private cost of their own. There is something worth naming plainly here, in a household defined so thoroughly by rank, by the enormous distance separating a queen from the girl who carried her chamber pot down the back stairs each morning. The distance was real, and this hour has never pretended otherwise. And yet, underneath that distance ran a shared condition that cut straight through it. A body managed daily with whatever tools a person's century and a person's station actually gave them. A private discomfort endured without complaint, because complaint accomplished nothing and discretion was, in this world, very often the only real currency a person without rank or fortune actually possessed. Katherine of Aragon and Beatrice Hall lived, in the most literal sense, in entirely different worlds inside the same walls. They also, in a way this hour hopes has become truly visible, rather than merely stated, lived inside the identical daily discipline of managing a body that could never be permitted to look as tired, as cold, as frightened, or as devout as it actually privately was. There is one further pattern worth naming, quieter than the other four and considerably harder to prove from the surviving record. Though the evidence for it sits in plain sight across nearly everything this hour has already described. This household Beatrice endured 19 years of it by 1520, and would go on to endure roughly 16 more before the household she had given her adult life to was formally dissolved by a king determined to set his mistress aside. Maria de Salinas endured decades of it. When the final crisis came, when she herself was formally forbidden from any further contact with the Queen, she had crossed an ocean to serve. She defied that order and forced her way to Catherine's deathbed, regardless of what it might cost her. That endurance was not passive. It required exactly the kind of skill, discretion, and quiet daily labor this hour has spent so long describing, and it deserves to be recognized as its own considerable achievement, entirely separate from the achievements more commonly credited to queens and kings in the history books built around them. Return for a moment to the room this hour opened inside the Queen's privy chamber at Greenwich. April light, coming gold, and slanted through leaded glass. A gentlewoman kneeling before Katherine of Aragon with a pair of scented gloves in her hands. The Queen is still there, in your mind, hands resting, palm up on crimson velvet, tawny damask settling in careful folds around her, the last pearl pin being set into her hood before she rises to receive whoever waits beyond that door. It looked, at the start of this hour, like a portrait of total, effortless royal composure, a woman built entirely of dignity, without a single visible seam anywhere in the surface. You know now what that composure was actually built from, and what it actually cost the people standing closest to it. You know Beatrice Hall, 29 years old that spring, a gentlewoman who had crossed the sea from Spain as a frightened child of 10, and had spent 19 years since then making herself quietly, completely indispensable to a queen. You know that Beatrice slept most nights of her adult life on a straw pallet laid across the floor of the Queen's own outer chamber, close enough to two other sleeping women that she had long since stopped noticing another person's breathing beside her own, and that her back carried a low permanent ache. An ache she never once thought worth mentioning to anyone with the authority to change it. You know that the room around her, and every room like it throughout that crowded palace, held close to 200 people breathing the same still, unmoving air, night after night, air thick with the accumulated smell of rushes that had not been properly changed since before Lent, tallow smoke, and wool worn for months without ever once meeting water. You know that the gown Katherine wore that morning, tawny damask, stiff with pearls, had likely gone the better part of a season without any washing beyond careful brushing and a folded sachet of dried lavender tucked between its layers. Because water ruined fabric, this costly and the era's own medicine considered a hot bath a genuine danger rather than a comfort, an act that forced the body's pores open wide enough to let corrupted air move straight into the blood. You know that the actual instrument of cleanliness at this court was never the outer gown at all, but the plain linen worn against bare skin underneath it, changed as often as a household's laundry capacity allowed. And that Beatrice began nearly every morning of her life working a length of dry linen cloth briskly across her own skin, exactly the way her physician had taught her, drawing sweat and oil away from her body without ever exposing a single pore to water she had been taught, sincerely and reasonably, to fear. You know what waited under the Queen's own damask, that no ambassador's letter home was ever meant to describe. A garment of coarse horsehair, worn next to bare skin as an act of genuine religious devotion, part of a discipline of penance Catherine had carried with her since girlhood in Spain. Kneeling alone on bare stone in a small private oratory until her own knees bled, watched only by Beatrice and one or two other women, sworn to a silence they kept for the rest of their lives. You know that this was never a private eccentricity, but a genuine, respected tradition of Franciscan lay devotion, and that Catherine's own mother had modelled precisely this kind of severe, unshowy piety across an entire reign, and that the woman kneeling and bleeding on that stone floor several nights a week was the same woman who would rise the next morning, compose her face into the same unreadable calm every visiting ambassador praised without exception, and receive whoever waited beyond her chamber door, as though nothing in the previous night had happened at all. You know that the chamber pots kept discreetly under velvet skirts throughout this household were carried down and emptied twice daily into open courtyards by servants whose names appear nowhere in any surviving record of this reign, and that the same women managed, with equally unrecorded skill, the private, monthly logistics of menstrual cloth, laundered and folded, timed carefully around whatever the day's ceremonial demands required. You know that the household's physicians bled its members according to a calendar tracking the moon against the zodiac, drew forth vomit with prepared emetics for complaints as minor as a heavy meal or a common cold, and considered this active visible intervention a genuine mark of skilled medical care rather than anything resembling neglect. A system Beatrice herself submitted to perhaps half a dozen times across her years at court, always emerging pale and heavy-limbed, in a way she had long since stopped finding alarming, since every other woman around her described feeling exactly the same afterward. You know that the food reaching even the Queen's own table depended on salt, smoke, and imported spice, doing genuine, skilled work to manage the gap between slaughter and plate in a household with no reliable way to keep anything properly cold. That rendered animal fat kept in earthenware pots throughout the kitchens carried its own particular heavy smell into the very beams and walls of the palace's working wing, and that the heavy spicing Tudor cookery is remembered for today, represented not desperation, but a real thoughtful culinary tradition, balanced according to the same humoral logic that governed every other decision this household made about the body. You know that keeping this entire machine running fell, in real terms, to Maria de Salinas, who balanced a crown allowance that did not always arrive on schedule against the genuine daily needs of nearly 200 people, and that under her, by any honest modern accounting, chronically exhausted and, in Beatrice's own case, permanently marked by the cold and the damp of stone corridors, no wall hanging could ever fully seal against. You know that a single visible misstep inside this household, a careless word repeated in what had seemed a private conversation, an unexplained hour away from an assigned post, could end a career and a family's prospects within days. Under standards of discipline set down explicitly in household ordinances, like the ones Cardinal Wolsey would formalize for the king's own establishment just a handful of years after this particular spring, and that Beatrice had spent 19 years mastering a discretion, simply the shape of her own personality, rather than anything she still experienced as effort. And you know what sat beneath every single one of these systems, quieter than any of them, and shared by every person in that household, regardless of rank, the memory of the sweating sickness that had already struck England 4 times by 1520, a disease that had already taken a woman Beatrice had crossed the ocean with as a child, that every servant in that crowded, close-aired household watched for privately in their own bodies, with a vigilance so constant the ordinary condition of being alive inside the year 1520. None of this makes the opening image of this hour a lie exactly. It only makes it considerably more complicated than any single portrait was ever built to hold. Catherine really did stand in that chamber that April morning, hands gloved and folded, composed into the same serene dignity that visiting ambassadors sincerely admired and faithfully recorded, without exaggeration, in letters sent home across Europe. Beatrice really did kneel before her, fastening those gloves with real, practiced care, her own chapped hands steady, despite whatever ache the previous night's straw pallet had left in her back. Beneath every visible surface in that room sat a person managing real physical cost with the best tools their century had actually given them. Tools built from centuries of careful, serious reasoning that simply began from premises modern mind would eventually discard entirely, and built, on top of those premises, an elaborate, demanding, and remarkably coherent world that asked something real of every single body living inside it. Katherine of Aragon is not the porcelain figure hanging in a handful of English and Spanish galleries, dignity without a crack anywhere in the surface. She is a woman who bled onto stone several nights a week for a faith she never once performed for anyone's benefit, who managed a body that would, in the years just ahead of this particular spring, fail her again and again. The same composed public face that made her genuinely beloved among the ordinary people of England for the whole of her difficult life. She is resilient, resourceful, and quietly exhausted, in exactly the way every other woman inside her household was resilient, resourceful, and quietly exhausted, each in proportion to her own particular rank and her own particular burden. And she looks magnificent in that morning light, gloved hands folded, pearls catching the gold coming through leaded glass, not despite any of what this hour has just spent so long describing. Right in the middle of all of it. Beatrice Hall did not exist under that exact name, though her story stands, as faithfully as the surviving record allows, for the considerable number of women who crossed an ocean in Catherine's original retinue. Maria de Salinas did exist, and her loyalty is not invention. She remained close to Catherine through every reversal the coming years would bring, defied a direct royal order forbidding her any further contact with the Queen she had served since girlhood, and reached Catherine's bedside during the final illness that would end the Queen's life in January of 1536, arriving, by every surviving account, I to be with her at the very end. That single act of defiance, arriving against explicit royal command to sit beside a dying friend, says more about what 19 years and more of shared endurance inside this household actually built between these women than any portrait, any ambassador's dispatch, or any formal household ordinance ever could. The candles in that first room have burned low by now, wherever this hour has actually left them. The gloves are fully drawn on. The Queen has risen from her cushion of crimson velvet and moved toward whatever door waited beyond the frame this hour first opened inside, and somewhere behind her, in a chamber that will never appear in any surviving portrait of this reign, a straw pallet sits folded against the wall, waiting for the night to come around again, the way it always does. The way it has for 19 years, the way it will for years still to come. Sleep well tonight, in whatever quieter, warmer century you happen to be resting in, and spare a thought, if you can, for the women who carried the water, emptied the vessels, laundered the linen, and knelt in careful, unremarked silence beside a queen bleeding onto cold stone for a faith the whole glittering surface of her reign was built, deliberately and completely, to keep hidden from view.